All right. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. We do appreciate it. And I also want to extend our gratitude to the NSTIC Program Office for their guidance and, more importantly, for their patience. We are a true pilot. And we are a pilot of private and public organizations that set out to create a cross-sector identity ecosystem that is intended to meet NSTIC goals 1 and 2. That's to build and implement an identity solution as well as develop an encompassing framework that will govern and operate it. If you noticed, we're not focused on goals 3 and 4, promoting and getting widespread usage. We're more focused on taking the technologies, assembling them together, having an end-to-end system, as well as putting a trust framework in place that will meet our needs. So our identity ecosystem will prototype and pilot this end-to-end solution that integrates all identity ecosystem components spanning both private and public sectors. So that's important. We're looking at from relying parties and identity providers to attribute verifiers and attribute providers to privacy-enhancing technology providers and credential service providers. All those components are considered and integrated in our CSDII solution. So as I mentioned, each one of our team members that we're showing here on the cover slide brings a unique skill set and expertise from the complexities of the identity management domain. And we do have good and strong representation from our team today. So if there are some questions at the end of the presentation or presentations today, we do have the folks in-house. We have representation from each one of these different teams. So today I'm going to walk you through the CSDII solution and how the roles and responsibilities are distributed across the team and how where we are now and where we are going. So our objective, as we point out in the top of the slide here, is really to increase the confidence in end-user identity by leveraging DMV in-person proofing to strengthen the authentication events while maintaining user privacy when accessing online services. That's a mouthful, but what I want you to emphasize on are a few key pieces there. We're looking at, of course, increase the confidence in end-user identity. I think that's a generic goal that all the pilots are emphasizing and building up. If you notice here, we're not saying level of assurance 2. We're not saying leveling up a credential. We're using generic terms. We are trying to adhere to the 863 standard. We are looking at some of the draft versions of some new standards that are coming out. We're taking those into consideration, but we're using terms like increased confidence. We're trying to, actually strengthen the authentication, so on and so forth. But one of the key team members that we do have is the Commonwealth of Virginia, DMV. And as you know, and everybody in here who has a driver's license issued by one of your Bureau of Motor Vehicles, Division of Motor Vehicles, is you go through a rigorous process through that in-person proofing. They have the information there about you. They store that information. And we, being AMVA, we provide the infrastructure there to be able to get to those DMVs. And so what we're trying to do here is actually leverage some of that in-person proofing information, of course, to actually strengthen the authentication events. And we'll get into more of what that means. And big concern there, of course, is not to leave out maintaining user privacy and when the user's accessing those online services or sites. So our approach is not to issue or create credentials. Rather, we're piloting the ability to consume credentials of various strengths and leverage access to DMV data to increase the confidence the user is who they claim to be. So that's important here. Again, we're not issuing the credentials. We're actually, using them and leveraging them. With true and successful completion of the DMV vetting, CSDII is providing the option for the user to memorialize the process by obtaining a stronger credential issued by an identity provider or credential service provider. One example is a user enrolling in a gesture biometric with BioSig, and future possession of this credential is indicative of the user previously completing the vetting process. So we're saying that we're going to combine some of these authentication events, and as you go through and vet with our DMV or vet through some of these more advanced enhancements, that you can memorialize that, and the CSP or the credential service provider can issue a higher level credential. So to meet this objective, the CSDII team is working in a stepwise fashion to build the necessary capabilities. And the capabilities are in order of implementation, are represented in that arrow graphic. So we start out, and again, we're using generic terms here, and we'll get into more detail about what these generic terms mean in an upcoming slide. But we're going to start out implementing strong authentication, apply some other techniques for a stronger authentication, and then we're going to cap that off with a stronger credential, and then we're going to produce this consolidated claim set and have the RP actually utilize that consolidated claim set on behalf of the user. So knowing that the self-assured credential is available, our strong authentication represents a verification of attributes against the DMV authoritative data. So that's verifying attributes, and at this point we haven't bound that to an individual. The next step is the stronger authentication, which represents a combination of second and multi-factor verification methods. And then we'll implement an example of a user enrolling with a stronger credential at a credential service provider. And then finally, consolidating the claim set and presenting back to an RP with confidence that the individual has utilized a combination of verification and authentication steps that provide sufficient assurance that the individual says who they say they are. So keep in mind that the RP can define the level of verification authentication necessary for access to their service or site. That's key. So it's not requirement for a relying party to sign up for all these authentication steps. It depends on the business need defined by the relying party to the extent that they want to enforce these authentication events. So some of our challenges that we faced in no particular order. Here, identified trust framework model to meet CSDII business needs. So us trying to define a single trust framework defined for the pilot that will give the relying party the options to define a policy that will define the level of risk that they're comfortable with. At the same time, the trust framework needs to balance unique business, legal, and actually technical characteristics of the states and private businesses. We are cross-sector, and that's one of the other key pieces that I want you to take away from here. We are bridging that gap between state entities and actually private entities. For example, take into consideration, the state government legal issues to include liability, grant authority, sovereign state, so on and so forth. So we had to take these into consideration when we were putting together the trust framework that would actually encompass all these steps and then the players in our ecosystem. Also, for the trust framework is how do we find a trust framework that is actually scalable, both horizontally and vertically, across jurisdictions, across states, and in the multiple domains in each one of those jurisdictions. Challenge number 2, bind the self-assured credential to a user without impacting the identity provider. Early on, we maybe naively thought that we'd be able to influence the identity providers to modify their user profiles to accept or store stronger credentials or notification of a stronger credential. Since then, we've kind of pulled back on that approach and that requirement. So we're going in with the assumption now that we're going to take some of those credentials as is and then we'll work around that to actually generate, the authorization events and the higher credentials. Other challenge there, leverage in-person proofing on remote authentication events. Of course, we know that there's that strong in-proofing event that happens at the DMV. How do we take advantage of that for the person sitting at their computer who wants to get this higher level credential, in an electronic fashion? Not have that person wait for a notification in the mail, not have that person have to go to a remote site to prove their identity. So we want to take advantage of that in real time. So we'll show you what our solution is in an upcoming slide. Of course, one of the other challenges were create composite claim set with privacy-enhancing attributes. So as the verifications and authentications are orchestrated and consolidated, how do we ensure non-traceability, non-linkability between ecosystem components? And how do we create those derived attributes without exposing the underlying PII data? So something that you'll probably see is common amongst all the pilots. One of the things here at the bottom of the screen, you'll also notice that as we're actually generating these capabilities, creating them, and then having to mature these capabilities, there's a bottom arrow there too. So this is to represent time as we're ongoing. Of course, we're going to be evolving that trust framework, and we're going to show you what the timeline is for, the initial drop for the trust framework and the initial drop for these capabilities. Also important here, and it's an evolutionary step, is the user experience. So that's both from an administrative point of view as well as an end user point of view. We know that, that is one of the key aspects here to get usability, to get people to start to use this system, to talk about the system, and for the system to grow, is to have a pleasant user experience. So this is a high-level graphic of our timeline and our milestones. What I did was map some of those events that we talked about on the previous slide just in very simple format here. You're going to notice that we do have multiple phases in our pilot effort, and we're showing here the high-level milestones necessary to satisfy the objective that we shared on the previous slide. So our proof of concept continues through the end of July, at which time we transition into a pilot phase. So proof of concept is just that. That's a laboratory environment using basically fictitious data. It's a place for us to verify and validate that these capabilities are being built to the requirements and meet the needs, of the user community. We're showing strong authentication, our stronger authentication event, and generating the stronger credential and consolidating that claim set. So that is all going to be done by the end of the proof of concept. There is an overlap between the proof of concept and pilot prep period, and then we're going to transition to a pilot period, and we'll get into what that means. Now, you'll notice right below those capabilities and the milestones, you're going to see TF, and that's for the trust framework. We are showing version 1 and version 2 of that trust framework. So version 1 is underneath our belts. But what does that mean? So we have that version 1 represents the aspects of the trust framework, of the business, legal, and actually technical agreements, policies, and procedures that are common to all the ecosystem components. And we're going to get to the model that we're following for the trust framework. So, one of those, there's a carrot out there for you to, actually pay attention to the end of the presentation. So I'll tell you what trust framework that we're decided on and what we're doing to enhance that trust framework. So version 2 augments version 1 with the add-ons and the extensions that are necessary to cover the unique aspects of each of the component participant types. So as we go forward, you can think of as version 1 is the common ground rules, common agreements amongst all components, and then version 2, we're getting into the unique idiosyncrasies and what that does to the different components of the trust framework. Okay, so moving on. High-level graphic of our logical architecture showing the ecosystem components and how they're logically grouped and connected to meet our objective. So what I'm doing is actually walking you through broad overview, high-level architecture. We're going to talk about, the user journey. We're going to get into showing a use case and so on. So on this graphic, you're going to see that we have the user at the top of our pyramid. Relying party directly connects to the user. And then there's our PETP. That's representative of the privacy enhancing technology provider. So what we're identifying is each role and the team member responsible for each role in our ecosystem. And as you can see, that we do have that logical break between the relying party and the rest of the components down here in the authentication and verification phase. So you can think of this tier as there's the user services that are defined by the relying party. They're defining, user services that are provided by the relying party. They're providing and defining the business requirements necessary for the ecosystem. And the privacy enhancing component in the middle is really the enforcement point for the policies that are going to be defined by the relying party. And then as the enforcement is orchestrated by the privacy enhancing piece, they're actually distributed out to the various components of the authentication and verification components. We have our commercially available IDPs, or identity providers. We have our attribute verification piece from ANVA. We have credential service providers from BioSig. There's a Microsoft component and a CA component as well. And so depending upon how the relying parties, depending upon how the relying party defines their policy, they will, the privacy enhancing piece will actually orchestrate and verify the different components that are necessary to be combined back into that consolidated claim set to be sent back upstream to the relying party. So you'll see there is, connectivity between identity provider and user, credential service provider and user. Of course, as was shown on the previous pilot, there is some interaction from the user directly to the identity provider to enter some credentials, similarly to the credential service provider. So here, in other words, we're showing the consumer of our ecosystem, we're showing the enforcement point of the ecosystem, and we're showing the various levels of authentication and credential, authentication and verification. Okay, walking you through the user journey of our ecosystem. So this is showcasing the user journey as well as decision points in the CSDII business process. I'm not going to be walking through each individual activity shown in the flow here. I am just trying to show overall that there are decision points along the way. And depending upon what the policy is that the relying party has defined is how we're going to execute those decision points. So in other words, that the user visits the relying party, there's some information provided, user logs in to the IDP, and then there's a decision point. Okay, now at the privacy enhancing technology piece, is there verification of attributes? If so, there's a flow that will route the user through that experience to enter some additional attributes that are going to be verified through ANVA with the DMV. And then at that point, there's another decision point. Okay, does the relying party require a second factor or a multi-factor authorization? And so then you see on that dividing line. So to the left of that dividing line is simply the identity provider and the attribute verification component of the ecosystem, and to the right is the credential service provider enrollment and verification. So what we're doing here to enroll in our credential is that we're going to, in our remote proofing component for this is critical to this final step, is that we are going to again ask for additional information from the user that is housed at the DMV. We're going to walk that user through a knowledge-based authentication activity here to actually prove remotely who that person is. So this information is housed at the DMV, unique to that person, collected at the in-person proofing phase, and actually stored at the DMV. So once we walk them through that knowledge-based authentication step, the user will then have the option to memorialize that authentication by enrolling and enrolling with a credential service provider who will then issue that credential. So then going back through, the idea is that the user will enter that credential, will only need to enroll with that credential once, and then any future use, they'll be able to reuse that credential for that relying party policy requirement. So the idea is once they walk through the various phases of the authentication events and the enrollment or the entry of that credential, the privacy enhancing piece will consolidate that claim set and send back the information to the relying party to grant access to the user. I'm kind of hurrying through this because I know that we're running short on time. So one of the first use cases that we're dealing with is with the Virginia DMV. So they are acting as a relying party for the initial use case. We call this the casual sale use case. That is the sale of a vehicle between two people in the Commonwealth of Virginia, person to person. So the key point here is that going through a casual sale online is going to require a seller authentication and a buyer authentication to make sure that the seller owns the vehicle and the buyer then has agreed to buy that particular vehicle. And then, of course, they're going to need to actually register that vehicle. So the point here is not really what the business process is behind here. The point here is that we do need to go through a higher level of assurance that these people are who they say they are. So we're going to walk them through these authentication events and have them prove that, one, they own the vehicle, and two, they are who they say they are. But one note here is that the Virginia casual sale is going to be this use case, and the Virginia relying party in this particular case is going to be deployed to a production-like environment to exercise all the pilot. But to exercise all the pilot capabilities, the other components in our ecosystem are going to be in production. So even though this RP is not necessarily run in production, the case has multiple benefits to CSDII. One, to help with the bootstrapping issue that we had of onboarding an RP. We're developing the trust framework in parallel to bringing on some relying parties. And so we had that issue. It's the issue of, with the chicken and the egg. We have a relying party we need to onboard, but we're still defining the agreements that we need to onboard that relying party. So using this use case is helping us through that bootstrapping exercise. And two, that this is a benefit to the DMV community as a whole. There are other DMVs who are interested in this casual sale use case, how it can be implemented, so they would like the proof of concept to see that it can be done. So you can see here, I'm not going to go into detail. We do talk about the specific attributes that are going to need to be verified and actually consolidated and returned back to the relying party. So accomplishments and near-term milestones. So in the first one, we do talk about the trust framework. We have made a lot of headway in our trust framework. Now, mind you, going into this, there were some ideas and some concepts about what should and shouldn't be used. We did not identify and confirm a trust framework that we were using right off the bat. So there was an evolution and there was an analysis effort done to determine what would best fit the CSDII ecosystem. So our pilot did follow a methodical approach to evaluate, and we looked at 6 model trust frameworks and how they aligned with the trust framework requirements for our CSDII pilot project. And it turned out that of the 6 that we looked at, and we can talk to you about what those 6 were, the In Common Trust Framework model was found to be the most robust, mature, and one that was actually scalable of those reviewed for our CSDI efforts. So we are following the In Common Trust Framework. So version 1 that we're talking about here is really the rebranding and actually customizing of the common agreements from the In Common Trust Framework for the CSDII effort. And version 1.1, that's what we call the operation. That's what we call the operational. So the common agreements amongst all the components. Version 1.1 is the extension. Of 1.0 to augment the operational trust framework with the business, legal, and technical specifics unique to each component and participant types. So those unique cases that we need to account for relying parties, for for credential service providers, and so on. And version 2.0 that we're being worked on is a final revision that's post-review by the team, available stakeholders, and the Virginia Office of Attorney General. And to let you know that even though we did start out with the Virginia DMV as a relying party, we are looking at, and we have a high probability of success in onboarding a health IT provider, and we're looking at higher education. Now, we do have very strong leads for the health IT provider. We're getting very close to signing them on, but they still haven't inked on the bottom line, so we cannot reveal who that is at this time. Hopefully, within the next month, we'll be able to provide additional information, but that has a high probability of success. From a technical perspective, some of the accomplishments that we have, of course, we've worked on the integration of all our components, so brokered communication between that orchestration piece or between that privacy enhancing piece and those components that actually touch and link to it. The capabilities that we showed earlier on, we have some dates associated with those that will be able to be in a fully developed mode. So we're talking about the strong authentication piece or the verification against the Virginia DMV attributes that will be in place by the end of the month. The stronger authentication, so the second and multi-factor components, end of June. And then finally being able to enroll through the KBA process and being able to use that credential and have that consolidated claim set will be by August 1st, and that will put us at the beginning of our pilot. So some of the lessons learned here, we're getting ready to wrap up. Okay, just let me share with you that as we learned here, some of our lessons learned were around the relationship between the state government and the private industry or commercialization, and trying to bridge those two domains and what we needed to do. So we learned that the ecosystem must support basically the spectrum of public sector privacy requirements and private sector fiduciary requirements. Very key here, and of course we needed a trust framework that would support those various positions and everything in between. We did talk about the user experience is critical both from an end user and an administrator point of view, and it turned out that integrating the components from a technical point of view is obviously easier than the definition of the business approach and defining the trust framework that all these components need to abide by. I know I'm getting the high sign and the hook off the stage, but thank you very much. And we do have I have my information on here, then this presentation will be made available through the website. And like I said, we do have representation here from the team from all the member organizations, so we'll be happy to entertain questions. Thank you.